So we've sort of started at the very start with Revelation 9 and looking at the way Josiah literally understood it, and then we've really identified this dynamic between the Byzantines and the Ottomans. And so now, and we've looked at the, I think, the fullness of the structure of the first and second woes, and on this we're going to we're going to be looking at this segment, the first woe and the period up to the second woe, and we're going to sort of swap to a bit more of a focused look at one of these emperors who was ruling in the lead up to this time when Constantinople, which is the 1/3, the Greek division of Rome, when it actually fell. So we're going to be looking at an emperor called John V Palaiologos. It took me a long time to learn how to say. I still get it wrong. But essentially, we're going to be looking at the way his life sort of is the same life as the empire, but on a smaller scale. Oh, actually, sorry, one more thing before I get into this. Before I get rid of this, I just wanted to clarify a few things. I really should have thought to do this first. When we're looking at July 27, and I was saying that it's we're directed to heaven to understand what happens on this day. If you want to know what the actual event is, and you look at the verses, and it says, and a voice said, you're shown a voice, and the command is given to release the 4 angels. So you're directed to heaven, and then you've got that little event there, which is the command. So that's the event, if you like, which happens on that day. And I also just wanted to stress, with these 3 lines here, I'm not really suggesting that it's actually line upon line. Obviously, the end of the siege is going to be the Sunday law, and the end of this line is going to be August 11, 9/11. I'm not saying that they're actually line upon line, I'm just showing that they have similarities, and my main point is that you put that 1.5 on the end. So it seems to me like it's quite valid to do that. So, sorry, changing gears again. I'll clear this now. So like I said, we're looking at one particular emperor, and we're looking at the way his life seems to show the same characteristics as the line as a whole. So he was John V Palaiologos, and he came to power in 1341. So you've got here, we're going to be using 1299 as our frame of reference, because there are events that happen in this history that also are paralleled in other portions of history, but we derive the significance of the way they interrelate from the fact that they all come during the first woe. It's our magnifying glass, if you like, to see how these events relate to each other. And you'll see as we go on, the parallels are quite striking, even though there are events in other portions of, outside of this time period that you really, it gets your attention prophetically, but how do you differentiate? So one of the things that I'm looking at is the fact that this is our we're doing everything in reference to this frame. So we're starting in 1299. So he comes to power in 1341 as an 8-year-old. His father died, who was emperor, and he was, so John V came to power as an 8-year-old. It's a little bit unclear exactly who has power, but we know that he had his coronation in that year, but he was set up with a regency. So because he was a minor and not really considered mature enough to rule, even though he was emperor, it was sort of like a co-regency thing with a team of people acting as the regents. But we can look here that between 1299 and 1341 is 42 years. So I'm going to say that this is, 42 is a symbol of the 1260. So you can put that in there leading up to the beginning of his reign. So he was the 4th emperor of his dynasty. He comes from the family of I'm not sure how to say the plural, Palaiologos, I think. So it was the last ruling dynasty. And he was the 4th emperor in that sequence, and he was the 7th from last. So that's significant when you start to think about 7 thunders. He was the 7th from the last. He came to the throne at the age of 8. He had a very troubled and fractured career. He was deposed several times and then reinstated upon the throne. But he had a long reign. He reigned for about 50 years, and that's a third of the first woe. So he's, in my opinion, he is the most significant emperor in this whole sequence. We also, I'll get to that, sorry. So we'll start looking at the characteristics that we can put on a line. So I think this is quite clearly a time of the end. This is the commencement of John V. And so he was a minor, and he had regents ruling sort of in his place, really. The regency that was set up around him was composed of his mother and of his father's best friend, who, while his father was emperor, he was the power behind the throne. He was his best friend. He was the real power behind the throne. He was a very good politician. He was a very good statesman. All those sorts of qualities. So he becomes the head of this regency. We might even just put it here. So we're going to just call him John K. It's John Cantacuzena for this regency. And also his mother, Anna of Savoy. Now, what you'll find happened is that even though John V's father actually stipulated that this individual, John Cantacuzena, was to be the regent and to be the caretaker of his family should anything happen to this emperor, and that was initially put in place, what you've got happening afterwards is a derailment of his position at the head of that regency. So this is in, we'll just put here, this is October, September. So we're going to say legitimate regency, derailed. I've got a quote here. This is from, I haven't got my reference. I know what book it's from. read the quote. The storm broke in September 1341 when Cantacuzene left Constantinople to perform his military duties in Thrace. So this is while he was the head of that regency. As soon as he was gone, his political opponents, led, bribed, or flattered by Alexios Apokalkos, his rival, whipped up support for the formation of a regency composed of the Patriarch and the Empress Anna. The Patriarch of the Church needed no persuading that he was effectively its head, and Anna was induced to sign an order for Cantacuzene to resign his command and disband his army. So as soon as this legitimate regent left the city, his rivals flattered and bribed people into signing him out, just writing him out and setting up a new regency. So I'm going to mark this as leadership bypassed and make that 9/11. It's from the papacy in the Levant. And I'll get the page reference. So that's one 9/11 characteristic that we have there, but there are others. We also have, with the events that came after, another quote here: the regency of Empress Anna and the Patriarch. So this is what was set up in place of the first regent. And the Patriarch, between 1341 and 1347, was a catastrophic interlude in Byzantine history. The economy of the empire ran down, and the Byzantine gold coinage, once the only stable currency in the Christian world, had to be devalued and depreciated to the point of worthlessness. So you've got economic ruin here. I'm not sure how I'll put it up. It's interesting also to note that you've got this 42-year period from here to here. So that's 42. And when you take it through to 1425, which we'll get to, you've got 126 years here, and it's broken into 42 and 84. Then, so we're marking this as 9/11, then you skip forward from 1798 through to 1840. That's 42 years. And then from there through to 1924, which we're going to show is, I think, a prophetic marker for the end of the Ottoman Empire. It's 126 years. So this is 9/11 in this history. And then this seems to have characteristics of 9/11 in this history as well. So it's interesting that Anna of Savoy, who was the mother of John V, was a Catholic princess, and she came from Italy, and she married into the Byzantine royal family. And so she always seems to exert an influence in favour of Catholic union. And one of the major, dynamic at this point of the final part of the Byzantine Empire is that they're being really pressed between the Ottomans and the papacy. So they are an empire on their last legs. They're heading into their decline that they're not going to recover from, and the Ottomans are just engulfing territory around them, and it's inevitable really that they're going to finally capture the whole empire. But what the Byzantines are doing is desperately trying to offer peace to the papacy, hoping that the papacy, who is riding all the Catholic Western nations, trying to get them to direct military aid to the Byzantines so that they can fight off the Ottomans. And so you've always got this dynamic where the Byzantines are trying to pay lip service to the papacy, saying, oh yes, we'll join with you again so long as you send us, galleys and armies and things like that. And it's this dance that they do. But the backdrop is that that Ottoman conquest of Byzantium is inevitable. So that really frames the life of John V. It really was turned up from his reign onwards. And the fact that his mother was a Catholic princess made him very favourable to the idea of reuniting with Rome in order to receive this help, so they hoped. And when John V matured and became a sole legitimate emperor in his own right, he did something quite interesting which no other emperor in his time period attempted to do. And we have another quote here, and I hope I've put the reference for this. Papacy and the Levant, the 13th and 14th centuries. Page 225 and 226. On 15 December 1355, John V signed a remarkable and well-known crucible binding himself to secure the obedience of the Greek Church to the Holy See in return for military aid against the Turks. That's another thing that we need to touch on, is the fact that there was essentially just racial hatred between the Latins and the Greeks at this point. They just detested each other, and because the Byzantines had their own church, which was essentially just slightly different, Catholicism, but they had that schism, and the papacy always wanted the primacy over the entirety of the Christian world, whereas the Greeks liked their own church. They had developed slightly different rituals and things like that over the centuries. So they liked their distinctiveness, but in particular they liked their ethnic and their national sort of identity. And so that was a real sticking point for the population. You can see what a position this puts the emperors in. They need to try to appease the papacy and have union with them to save their population, but the population hates the Catholic Church and riots every time they make an attempt to affect that unity. It's interesting that you can note civil unrest, but also I think it's a contrast, knowing that Eastern Rome carries the symbolism that they are the armies of Rome when we bring it to us, to note that civil unrest over this issue of joining with Catholicism. I think it's a contrast more than a direct parallel, because we know that they're going to be asking for it in our time, but I think it's notable, yeah. So this is what he's grappling with, satisfying his population and satisfying the churches. Anyway, John V, He asked Pope Innocent and he asks for a bunch of military aid. So he signed this remarkable crucible, which is where he's saying, I'm going to convert to Catholicism, and within 6 months, I'm going to ensure that my whole church and population converts as well. Please send us everything that you can against the Ottomans. That's essentially what he says. He sent it with some special, high status envoys, and it's called the Golden Bull. He takes these Golden Bull to the Pope. Innocent's reply is dated 21 July 1356, showing that John's crucible and letters of credence, etc., the Pope acknowledged receipt of the letter and commended John's solemn expression of devotion to the papacy. Expressed his willingness to receive legates and nuncios from Avignon, and that this is his direct words to John V, that you would make every effort to the best of your ability to see that all the peoples under your imperial authority and subject to your jurisdiction, whether laity or clergy, of whatever condition, status or dignity, should be faithful, obedient, reverent, and devoted to us and our successors. Pope Innocent, and the cardinals were overjoyed to hear John's crucible read, and they exulted in John's long-desired and expected return to ecclesiastical unity, as well as in the promised conversion of the vast multitude of his subjects. So he pledges himself. A crucible is a decree. Mm-hmm. So John 5. John 5 pledges Catholic conversion. 21st of July 1356. I'm going to say that is midnight. Because I believe, I haven't got the quote with me at the moment, but there's an article that Tarbo did where it shows that at midnight there are certain steps towards that union between doing away with the constitution, which guarantees the separation of church and state. So you have these steps. This is a pledge, which is, I think, on a personal level, is a good equivalent for that kind of meeting where you're going to take steps in order, planning to affect something. So I think that on a personal level that works. So the next event that we have is John V Palaiologos converts to Catholicism. So there's a lot of quotes, but they are important, and they put it better than I can. So one can imagine the excitement of the Roman populace. No ruling emperor had ever come from Constantinople to Rome since the time of Constans II. This is interesting that he gets compared to Constans II, who ruled officially as a Constantine. I forget his number, but Constans II was his nickname. He was actually a Constantine. So you've got Constans II here. Constans II actually captured the Pope in his history. He was a Byzantine emperor, and he captured the Pope, and the Pope died from mistreatment in that captivity. I'm not going into any of that now, but that's interesting. So no ruling emperor had ever come from Constantinople to Rome since the time of Constans II, 7 centuries before. And now this emperor from the legendary East had come to humble himself before their bishop and become a convert to Latin Catholicism. On 13 October, the Pope came to the city, where the Lord Emperor of the Greeks, John Palaiologos by name, was already awaiting him. And on St. Luke's Day, 18th of October, in the hospital of St. Spirito, he made his confession of faith in the presence of 5 cardinals and 2 protonotaries, and swore that he would always keep it. Afterwards, he signed it with his own hand in cinnabar ink, and with a golden seal he sealed the document, which was written in Greek and Latin, and he placed it in the archives of the church. Then on Sunday, the 21st day of the said month, the Lord Pope, coming out of the stairs of St. Peter's, received the Emperor as he mounted the stairs to meet him, and going into the church together, the Pope celebrated Mass in his presence. So that is again, it's the same book, page 372. So we're going to put this is the Midnight Cry. On a personal level, I think that this signifies, well, on a personal level it's a conversion, but then on the level of a nation, we're expecting to see the conversion of that nation to Catholicism at the Midnight Cry. So I think on an individual level it's a good parallel. So yeah, here are some comparisons to Constans II. He was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire from 641 to 668. Constans is a nickname given to the emperor who had been baptized Heraclius and reigned officially as Constantine. The nickname established itself in Byzantine texts and has become standard in modern historiography. It's interesting. Constans appointed a new exarch who marched on Rome with a newly loyal army, abducted Pope Martin and brought him to Constantinople, where he was tried for high treason before the Senate. He was banished to Chersonesus, present-day Crimea, and died shortly after as a result of his mistreatment. That's just a Wikipedia reference. So it's interesting that you've got this emperor took the Pope captive, and this emperor is being taken captive by the Pope, and they're both Constantines. Also, I think it's quite interesting that the Pope himself, the one who actually oversaw the conversion of John V, compared him to Constantine the Great. On 13 November, Urban issued an encyclical asking the Christian princes to aid the emperor. And on 29 January 1370, he sent a special appeal to the same effect to all the different countries of Europe, etc. The church could rejoice, he told them, when our dearest son in Christ, John Palaiologos, illustrious emperor of the Greeks, came to the Holy Apostolic See in a spirit of devotion, abjured the schism completely, and professed the Catholic faith. And we piously hope that even as long ago the conversion of the Emperor Constantine caused the conversion of innumerable peoples, just so, by the effort and example of the Emperor John, peoples without number who now follow the schism and errors of the Greeks will by divine grace return to the Lord's fold. So he's compared to this Constans who took the Pope captive, and he's also compared to Constantine the Great. I just find that interesting because if we're going to be looking at this as a Seven Thunders, which I think it is, you've got the first emperor in the sequence is Constantine of types, and the last one is Constantine. I see that a little bit, it pops up every now and again. You can see it's parallel from the beginning to the end of Seven Thunders. And that was the same book, page 313. So the last event that we have at the end of his long life, he was deposed a number of times, as I mentioned. He was deposed by a son and by a grandson, and he always managed to somehow claw his way back. At the time when he was deposed by his grandson, who marched on the city and was able to, I think, I haven't got the reference here, but John V was a very popular emperor when he began his reign, but as soon as he made that connection with the papacy, his population turned on him, and they just despised him. And in fact, when his grandson came to depose him, the people of the city opened the gate for him and let him in. So he came in and took over the throne. But he was not able to expel John V fully. There was a defensive structure which was a part of the walls of Constantinople. It was a fortress, a castle, which was actually built into the walls that surrounded Constantinople as part of the defensive system. And so the emperor was able to flee into that structure, and he was under siege there for 5 months until someone else came and rescued him. In the meantime, his grandson was reigning as emperor. But it's quite interesting when we consider that at the very end of this Seven Thunders scenario that I'm going to put out, we're going to be counting the destruction of Constantinople in one sense to be a Sunday law. And you have here, it's kind of like a fractal, you've got this structure that is inside the walls, part of the defense of Constantinople. And what happens is, when he is rescued and he's restored as emperor, the Ottoman Sultan forces him to actually raise that structure. So those walls of that fortress come down. So as far as I can gather, because it's an ancient structure, and when the Ottomans actually took over Constantinople, they got rid of a lot of things and they changed it. But there's a lot of record of this building. It's called the Golden Horn Castle. And this is going to be a very crude drawing. But you've got this city in here, and then you've got this system of walls around it. And you've got, in one of these walls, you've got this actual palace of castle, which is built in, it's part of the walls, and part of it comes down to the sea, and it is a defensive fortress that, for precisely the kind of scenario that the emperor found himself in, his own population let this rival emperor in, and so he fled to this structure and was able to hold himself there for 5 months until he was rescued. But it's interesting, I'm not sure that we go into much detail here, but I'll mention it. This usurper, who was John the Seventh, he was actually put up to this business by the Ottoman Sultan. So the Ottoman Sultan gave him the resources that he needed to effect this takeover. And when John V was reinstated as emperor, that same sultan, because remember at this point, sorry, I should put the date, this is 1390.
Can you grab one of the other pens? We'll chuck that one.
Oh, okay, no worries. Is it a bit...
Yeah, sorry.
No, you're right, it's good, thank you. That one looks pretty fresh. So this is 1390. It's just from... No, we'll do that. So he gets usurped by his grandson for 5 months in the year 1390. And I don't know if you remember this morning, but we saw that the Byzantines had actually been the vassals of the Ottomans since 1371. And so they were the vassals, and they had to accept the interference of the Ottoman sultans in their leadership. And of course, you've got all these rivals, all these ambitious young men wanting to take the throne, and they're willing to make all kinds of deals and compromises with the Ottomans to get the support that they need. So the Ottoman sultan at the time, I think it was Bayezid, actually put this emperor, this young usurper, up to it. So he gave him the resources that he needed to do it. He went and did it, and then when finally the old emperor was victorious, because they're still vassals of the Ottomans, John had to accept and execute the command given by Bayezid that this structure be raised. So those walls fell. And I'm kind of seeing in that it's a type of the city as a whole. So I'm going to call that the Sunday law of the life of John V. So you've got Golden Horn Castle, raised by order of the Sultan, because he had the power to do that. John V actually couldn't really say anything against it. He was a vassal, so he had to just be obedient and do that. Apparently, the shame of having to do that caused him to die just a few months later. So they are the main events in the life of John V, and to me, I think that is a fairly good mirror of what happens to the entire empire. And we'll just leave it at that for now. Oh, one thing. No, I'll do that later. So, yeah. So there's John V, probably the most important emperor in this sequence. A bit different now. As I mentioned, the mother of John V was Anna of Savoy, and she was a Catholic princess, and she married Andronicus III, John V's father, and was actually able to effect a lot of changes which resulted in the ultimate union of the Byzantines and the Catholic Church. So what we're going to look at now is a dynamic that seems to be apparent, where you can track a connection between the Catholic progression of relationship with the Byzantines and an Ottoman progression. So there seems to be this link. I'm not saying that it's cause and effect, but what I'm saying is that it's a definite dynamic that you can observe. So we might make this a bit darker. So we know we've got 27 July, the start of the First Woe, and the Battle of Nicomedia. So this was the first aggressive encounter between the Byzantines and the Ottomans. And we know that that marks the beginning of the First Woe. But interestingly, 27 years later, they had been, grabbing territory and doing raids and all that kind of thing in the meantime. But 27 years later, they actually captured their first city. This was just a battle. I think they got some territory, but they didn't capture a city. It was notable, but they didn't have a capital yet. They got their capital 27 years later, in 1326, on the 6th of April. So they captured the city of Bursa. From Constantinople, and it becomes their first capital. So we have a few little quotes here. Osman Ghazi died in 1326 and was succeeded by his son Orhan Ghazi, who captured the strategic city of Bursa in the same year, making it the first capital of the Ottoman state. That's from a book called Turkey, the Quest for Identity. No page number. Sometimes the Google Books previews don't give you a page number. Sorry. Another quote, when Osmond began his siege in 1317, the town held out for more than 9 years. As to the details of the siege of Bursa, almost nothing exists. It was a long siege, and all that can be said about it is that it may have been intermittent rather than continuous. When it fell on April 6, 1326, Osmond lay dying, so he never saw the inside of the city. His son Orhan became the second leader of the dynasty that became known as the Ottomans. Upon his occupation of the city, he named it the capital of the emerging Ottoman Empire. So that's quite firmly established that that event happened at that point in time. So, interestingly, when we look over on the Byzantine side, we've got something happening with the Catholic interaction. So we've got Anna of Savoy, who was the mother of John V. She actually marries into the family in this year. We might do this on 2 ones. So you've got she marries Andronicus, with a short net, the third. So, she was born into an important Italian noble family and was the daughter of Count Amadeus V of Savoy, a region in what is now southeastern France. She was betrothed and married to the Emperor Andronicus III at the age, so she was betrothed to be married at the age of 6, a not uncommon age for royal brides. She grew up in the imperial castles and palaces, etc. This is quite interesting. This is from The Byzantine Lady, 10 Portraits. Page 82. A contract was drafted and signed in September 1325, and about the end of November, Joanna of Savoy, henceforth to be known as Anna, left her ancestral home in Italy never to return. The Byzantines were much impressed and staged a grand reception for her and her company when they reached Constantinople in February 1326. But it had been a long and difficult journey for her in the middle of winter, and Anna succumbed to illness as soon as she arrived. Her wedding had to be postponed. It was not until October that she was fit enough for the ceremony. It was performed in Constantinople, probably by the Patriarch, according to the Byzantine rite, a fact which much annoyed the Pope. In his view, marriage between Catholics and Orthodox were uncanonical and forbidden unless specifically approved by the papacy. Pope John XXII had not been party to the arrangements made for the marriage of Anna, a pious Catholic princess, to a husband who, however exalted, was in schism from the one true church, so they say. Count Edward of Savoy, to whom the Pope wrote an angry letter, replied rather feebly and without much conviction that Anna might convert her husband. Well, she didn't convert her husband, but she certainly started the chain of events that led to the ultimate conversion of the whole empire. So we can see we've got here this marriage, so it introduces this Catholic element into the family. I hope I've got the quotes. All through this history, when John V is old enough and he's encountering these problems as the sole emperor, he has a lot of interactions with his family from Italy who are Catholic, and they aid him in lots of ways, and they put a lot of pressure on him to convert to Catholicism. So that's where a lot of the pressure actually comes from, So I don't think I'm going to actually go into those details just now, but we've got pressure and age from the Savoy family. So we know, we just looked at the fact that John V, he pledged himself to convert in 1355, and he actually converted in 1369. So we'll just put this here. So John V converts. So then, when we jump over to the Ottoman side, we've got something happening in that year as well. The Ottomans conquer the city of Adrianople in this year, and it becomes the second capital of the Ottoman Empire. The conquest of Adrianople, most probably in 1369, and the fact that Murad I made the city his new capital, indicate that the Ottomans considered themselves both an Asian and a European power. That's from the practice of strategy from Alexander the Great to the present. I'm just going to abbreviate it. Page 105. In 1369, the city was conquered by the Ottoman Sultan Murad I. He renamed it Edirne, this is Adrianople. The city remained the Ottoman capital for 84 years until 1453, when Mehmed II moved the capital to Constantinople after they conquered it. And I've got more quotes to show that that has happened in 1369. So, I'm just going to abbreviate this. Adrianople. And becomes the second Ottoman capital. I didn't get to go into this next one as much as I would have liked. So ultimately, the union of the churches was effected. They signed a decree. It was the third decree in the history. I'm not sure of the significance of that because I don't know quite how to line it up. But it was an official union. It occurred in 1439. And up here, you had, and I haven't gotten to research this as much as I would have liked, it was the Battle of Varna, which was, the Byzantines weren't actually involved in this, but they were relying on it. It was to do with all their allies, all their hoped-for allies, and they all got destroyed at the Battle of Varna. So we look at this church union, and it's interesting, like I was saying before, the Byzantine emperors pretty much had to grit their teeth and go through with it, knowing that their population was going to revolt on them, which happened every time they had this kind of interaction. Interestingly, they were brave enough to go ahead and make the actual union. This is not John V, this is way down the line. We're tracking all the way up to the end of Byzantium. But they were not brave enough to actually proclaim it. So that was part of the formalisation, I gather, part of the process. The last stage after they've discussed it and signed it, and I think they make some little formal proclamation amongst themselves, and then they proclaim it publicly. So they were not brave enough to proclaim it. And the popes, from this point hereafter, would make this a condition of aid, which never really came anyway. But as these poor Byzantine emperors are trying to, say, we joined up, help us please, they would say, well, where's your proclamation? Where have you put this publicly? And so they were never brave enough to do it until the very last one, the last Constantine. Constantine the 11th. He actually proclaimed the union. Finally, on December 12, 1452, the union was solemnly proclaimed in St. Sophia in the presence of Constantine, the legate, and the Patriarch Gregory, who officiated together with the assistance of 300 priests. That's quite interesting. On another line, I'm going to show you that I think that this is, from here to here, is midnight cry, but not now. But the infuriated populace rushed to the monastery, and we'll just drop down a bit. Henceforward, the church of St. Sophia, where the union had been proclaimed, was deserted by the people and remained empty until that gloomy vigil of 28 May 1453, which preceded the capture of Constantinople. So you can just mark here that they finally put in place the last part of the process. The population revolted. This was in the year 1452. And on the other side, we have the new Sultan, Mehmed II. He begins his siege preparations in 1452. That's when he starts. He comes to the throne with a mania for destroying Constantinople. And to begin with, he he seems friendly. And people consider him to be this kind of enigma. They don't know what to expect from him. And he comes across as being young and naive and friendly. And then he just turns and sets about preparing to besiege Constantinople with a fury. So they had the church union, which was not accepted by the populace, even though it was an official and binding union. They celebrated the union, and all the Byzantine priests deserted their cathedral and proclaimed that they were not going to enter again until it had been purged of the Roman pollution. But this changed on the 28th of May. It's really sad, actually. That evening, the last Christian service was held in the great church of the Holy Wisdom, the Hagia Sophia, which had been the heart of Eastern Orthodox Christianity for 1,000 years. Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox put aside their bitter doctrinal differences. Priests who held union with Rome to be a mortal sin now came to the altar to serve their unionist brothers. The cardinal was there, and beside him bishops who would never acknowledge his authority. and all the people came to make confession and take communion, not caring whether Orthodox or Catholic administered it. There were Italians and Catalans along with Greeks. The gold mosaics, studded with the images of Christ and his saints, and the emperors and empresses of Byzantium, glimmered in the light of 1,000 lamps and candles, and beneath them, for the last time, the priests in their splendid vestments moved in the solemn rhythm of the liturgy. At this moment, there was union in the Church of Constantinople. That's just the reference. There's a lot of letters and numbers. I'll find that. Here's another quote. This is from the last centuries of Byzantium. Page 386. On Monday, May 28, the defenders knew that the moment of truth was upon them. There was an ominous silence from the Turkish camp beyond the walls. The Sultan had ordered a day of rest before the great assault. He spent the day haranguing his troops and giving final instructions to his officers and to his admirals. In the certainty of imminent danger, the defenders forgot their quarrels and sank their differences. The emperor had the icons and relics from the city churches brought out and carried round the walls, while all the church bells rang. A procession was formed of Greeks and Latins chanting hymns and prayers. Toward the evening, the people made their way as if by instinct to the Cathedral of St. Sophia. The soldiers stayed at their post on the walls, but most of the rest of the population, Latins as well as Greeks, crowded together into the great church to pray for their deliverance. Common fear and common danger worked more of a wonder than all the councils of the church. Orthodox bishops and priests and monks, who had loudly declared that they would never set foot in their cathedral until it had been purged of the Roman abomination, now approached the altar to join their Catholic brethren in celebrating the Holy Liturgy. So what you actually have here is, how will we frame it? The descent finishes. Ends. And symbolically, it seems to me that this is the event that happens. They heal up the descent themselves, so that there's no more antagonism. But to me, that possibly symbolises when dissent is not tolerated. It's a point where there will be no dissent, or largely no dissent, because it's just not allowed. Yeah. So, what do we have on the Ottoman side? 29th of May, Constantinople falls. Finally, on 29 May, Mehmed launched simultaneous attacks from the sea and the land sides of the city that overcame the defenders. Pouring into the city through one of the gates that was forced, the Ottomans killed the emperor as he attempted to counterattack with his remaining defenders. The Turks spread out to sack the city, massacring so many that, in the words of eyewitness Niccolò Barbaro, blood flowed in the city like rainwater in the gutters after a sudden storm. The fall of Constantinople was a huge blow for the Christian world, but although Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade to again regain the city for Christendom, no concerted military response was made. Now styled the Conqueror, Mehmed declared his city to be the new capital and claimed to be the rightful successor to the Roman Empire. So that's something else. It becomes the third Ottoman capital, third and final. So, as I see it, you've got a clear relationship between something happening with the Ottomans progressing their relationship with Catholicism and a progression of the events with the Ottomans that are going to lead down to this point. We're going to look at some of these as waymarks in the next presentation, but I think that that's probably a good place to leave it for now, since we've had a lot to think about today. So that's fairly simple, I hope. So we'll just leave it there. I'll pray. Dear Father in heaven, we come before you and we give thanks. We know that time is short and that we have much to learn and much to understand. But we know that you are faithful, and that if we commit our ways to you, then you can work in us whatever it is that you desire or will. So we just thank you for everything that you've shown us. Thank you that we can be sure that you are leading us if we will allow you. And we just want to commit our ways to you once more. And we pray again that you'll be with us throughout the remainder of this Sabbath. Thank you. In Jesus' name,